Thank you very much. Okay, so I have so just to say as a bit of a preamble, I'm not an expert on the SDGs, so I'm going to talk about open access and how it relates to these various issues. I do think there is a lot that we can. I was very interested in Sarah's talk. Actually, I was listening to what you were saying and thinking there's a lot of similarities with the issues that we're seeing around access to information. So I think there's lots of kind of synergies there. Okay, so all right. So I'm going to talk about it in the context of equity, which is a big issue this year for the for open access, and I'm going to talk about open access and where that's kind of going as well, and perhaps try and tie it all together. All right, so just as a little preamble, this is the group that I spend 3 days a week being the director of. It's the Australasian Open Access Strategy Group. If you haven't heard of us, come and talk to me afterwards. I'd love to talk to you more about it. We advocate at a national level to try and develop a coherent approach to open access within Australia and New Zealand. QUT has been a really important part of that, actually, and I think it's very interesting that this meeting's happening today because it also sort of puts together the initiatives, I think, that have happened repeatedly at QUT as a university and its interests. We're also supported by 9 other universities in Australia and in New Zealand, and importantly, we also have a close relationship with Creative Commons, both in Australia and New Zealand, because a lot of the things I'm going to talk about are it's very important that we think about this not just from the point of access, but we think about it as the rights associated with access at the time. So hence our relationship with Creative Commons. So this is a paper from 2011 that looks at collaboration in science. If you were to look at this now, you'd see probably a much more diverse picture. Nodes sort of give an indication of the size of collaboration, and the links tell you where the collaborations are happening. Science and academia is a massively international enterprise. There is absolutely no question about it. And as we move on, it's clear that collaboration is becoming even more important. The number of international co-authors on papers, which is how this was measured, is becoming more and more common. And it's absolutely something that is recognised and supported and, encouraged by universities. We care a great deal about collaboration. We know that it's good not just for us as individual researchers, but it's also very good on a sort of global scale. However, if we think about, where we actually are, the truth is that half the world's population doesn't have access to information online at all. And I'm sure that many of you are familiar with this delightful cartoon, which talks about the difference between equality and equity. And I think it's a really valid way of thinking about the issue that we have at the moment. And I'll come back to the theme for Open Access Week this year, which actually is around equity, because we realise increasingly that when we talk about access, we're not starting from the same position, and most people are not in a similar point. And in fact, it's even worse than that, because not only do people not have access to things online, this is actually the reality. The picture on the right is where a large number of people are when it comes to access to information, let alone open access to information. So I will talk to you about what open access is, and I'm afraid I'm a bit obsessive about being precise about definitions in this area. And every so often we've sort of got to a stage where we've almost accepted that it's okay that we don't have access to academic information. That is primarily what I'm talking about in this context. I'm guessing that most people in this room are from well-funded universities, and when was the last time you couldn't access a paper that you wanted to read? Anyone going to put their hand up? Okay, and it was because...
Well, I have access to different universities. I can use my Griffith or my Lund, which is in Sweden, where I come from. But Lund has more access than Griffith, for instance, much more access, but I still couldn't access some documents and some academic papers for an article I'm working on.
Yeah, so that's astonishing, isn't it? And sometimes I sort of, we've kind of got used to the fact that that's an okay situation. Last night I was driving home, and I was listening to a fantastic lecture on the radio about gravitational waves. And if you haven't, I tweeted it last night because it was such a brilliant lecture. And I was sitting there thinking as I was driving, I actually know that this paper is open access because it was such an important paper at the time. But the fact that it even might not have been is so outrageous. This is, the culmination of 200 years of work, and the thought that even some of these papers are not available for everyone to read is outrageous, and yet we don't hold on to that enough, I don't think. Anyway, but this is the situation. Most people do not have open access to publications. Okay, so let's have a think about how access relates to these Sustainable Development Goals. So the first thing I would just say is that I wasn't really working in this space when the SDGs were being developed, not from the point of view of libraries or universities. I was working at a publisher at the Public Library of Science. And I think there were some missed opportunities to actually get open access to academic information within the SDGs. They're not specifically articulated in there. The group that did, I think, the most amount of work, and as I said, I'm not an expert in this, although one of the people who was heavily involved in this, Fiona Bradley, is now working at UNSW. She was working at IFLA when this programme was when they were campaigning to get access to information into the SDGs. She's written a really interesting paper which talks about the long-term, the 3-year programme it took at least to get this into the SDGs, and I'll show you what they actually came up with. But the fact is, access is clearly important, and it's not just important for something you want to measure as a sort of specific outcome. It can't, as UNESCO says, really, how do you do any kind of scientific work without acknowledging the importance of access to information? So UNESCO says that 10 of the 17 SDGs require scientific input, and their OA initiatives, sorry, am I doing this? All right, you can see it in red. The OA initiatives are built around the SDGs, and I think that's a really productive approach to take. IFLA did a really interesting thing, which is they developed this paper back in before the SDGs came out, and they managed to coordinate more than 600 signatories to this paper. So it kind of became impossible for access to information to be ignored. But IFLA is really a public library organisation. It does have academic libraries within it, but it's not, for example, primarily a university library body. But they felt that it was absolutely important to advocate for access. But the key thing that they really advocated for was envisaging a world with universal literacy, and this was what they campaigned for continuously throughout the entire process. And if you're interested in reading how it came to fruition, I would commend to you Fiona's paper on it, where she reflects on the importance of the policy approach that they took to get what they wanted into the SDGs. And this is where it actually ended up. It ended up in under 16, which is a slightly odd place for it to be in some ways, because 16 is also about access to human rights information. But this is the target that they ended up with, and includes ensure public access to information and protect fundamental freedoms in accordance with national legislation and international agreements. There's more in it than that. That is the measure that they have kind of taken as their most important point. But all of these relate. And in fact, when you start digging into any of the SDGs, access to information is important to all of them. I mean, how could it not be? I mean, I've just flagged up 7 here. Some of the ones that they specifically highlighted are the importance of technology and empowerment of women, so that's 5.B. Then there's things like strengthen efforts to share the cultural heritage. Innovation comes up time and time again, having the infrastructure, target 17.8, fully operationalise the technology and science and capacity building. All of this is important. All of this relates to access to information. So in many ways, I think there's a lot in there that if you want to advocate around increased access to academic information, you can, but there's nothing that's actually measuring it in a concrete way. And in fact, if you look at what they're doing right now to measure the SDGs, quite alarmingly, it's only very recently they've agreed on a proper framework for trying to measure things or to collect it. So there's currently, until very recently, there wasn't, as I understand it, a coherent process for collecting information on how the SDGs were being measured. I mean, that strikes me as a really missed opportunity. And in fact, if just looking at what's happening with access to literacy, which is the most basic one that was that IFLA campaigned for, we're very far behind on access on literacy for children and adolescents for both basic reading skills and mathematical skills. So there's something, and it's only 12 years to 2030. So we're quite a long way behind what's actually needed. So to some extent, when I'm talking about access to academic information, which is really what the open access agenda is about, if we haven't even got half the world being able to read, you sort of do wonder, whether we're focusing on the right kind of things. Anyway, that's a bit of a diversion. So where do we go? I decided when I was thinking about this talk to go back and look at where we are with OA more generally, open access more generally. Again, this is not a new initiative. We've been talking about this for 15 years. I've been talking about this for 15 years, as have many people, including people at QUT. Tom Cochrane was one of the people who was involved with the Budapest Open Access Initiative early on. I've been involved with it more recently, but it was 15 years old last year. And this was actually the great... This was what they talked about when it was first announced back in 2003. And it says, an old tradition and new technology have converged to make possible an unprecedented public good. I think that's a great statement, and I actually don't think anyone's articulated that better since. And this plays absolutely into what the SDGs should be doing. The problem is we haven't really moved on that far from this, because what we have right now is that we still have inequity of knowledge, and it's a massive inequity. And if people, you've articulated that it happens in Australia, it absolutely happens in Australia. And one of the effects of it is this, which is that we have a massive sort of pirate access to knowledge that has kind of sprung up. I had a very interesting thing recently where I tweeted my frustration about not being able to access something. I meant it as an illustration, but somebody literally within about 5 minutes sent me the Sci-Hub copy. I do know how to do this, but anyway, it was quite interesting. The access has become something that people now feel so passionately about that they're willing to go to essentially illegal sites to access it. And just in case we don't think this is a problem in Brisbane, this is the log from this paper. It's a few years old now, but there's plenty of people downloading papers from Brisbane that are through Sci-Hub. So we absolutely know that the access to information is a problem in Australia. And where has this come from? Well, the problem is that we have this oligopoly of publishers, which has led to more than 70% of the literature in pretty much any discipline being owned by about 5 publishers. It's a massive issue. It's not just happening for publications now, as we were talking earlier about, it's also happening, these companies are buying up the infrastructure. And so access is going to be getting worse rather than better, because these companies are continuing to buy up these journals and infrastructure. And despite all of their kind of in-kind or perhaps their professed support for initiatives like the SDGs, the truth is this is what's happening. And I think we are being slightly naive if we don't call out these organisations on this issue. And so as a response to that, what's happening is there's sort of a legal way of getting around these publications has sprung up. There's a vibrant open source community that is now trying to change some of this, but it's not really dealing with the fundamental issue, which is that we have a system which essentially supports publishers holding most of the intellectual content of academic research. And then we have another big issue which I'll come on, which I think is even more important, which is that it's not really just enough to have access to information. Actually, we need to have access to the papers, we need to have access to the data, we need to have access to the code. And all of this is what really contributes to open science. Now, it says open science here, but I'll use that as a sort of metaphor for it's really open scholarship more widely. Which you think is a fairly simple concept, but when you actually start digging into what that means, you see things like this. So this is quite interesting. This is an organisation called Metadata 2020, which is trying to bring everyone together to agree what we need to do around standards, for example, for metadata. And this rather funny graph, what they did was they assessed a whole range of organisations who work in this space to see if people could agree on what the metadata standards should be. And literally, there was one, which is the one right at the top here. There is only one which people agree is essential as a metadata standard. All the other, if you look at all the different communities, everybody has their own idea of what's essential. And it's all different. So how on earth do you bring some coherence to that? And this, I think, is leading to a massive problem in moving forward because we have so many groups doing so much work that's so different. They're rarely talking to each other. And we are unable, I think, really to come to any conclusions about what's necessary. And so this is the situation we have. I've talked about the fact that people don't have access to information. If you talk about full open access, 15 to 20% of it is available fully open access 15 years after OA was initially defined. And there's a lot of soul searching going on at the moment to try and understand what's happening, and the Budapest Open Access Initiative did a survey of that last year. There are absolute barriers to change amongst publishers. We know that there is a massive pushback from them. And I think, again, we are sort of kidding ourselves as a community if we underestimate their resistance to change and their resistance to lose a business model that's very valuable to them. There are absolute problems with incentives, and this is a particular issue, I would say, in Australia, because Australian universities are very tied into league tables that are very important for their ranking. I've come from Europe relatively recently, and I've not seen that issue there. I think in Australia it's a particular issue. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I work with IP in Europe, so I'm an IT guy, so I have both backgrounds. You're right.
Yeah.
It's much more of an open program, much more accessible.
Yeah. And then there are issues around costs. And there's why, I'll come on to a little bit about what I think we might be able to do about this, but we also have this massive focus still, I think, on just traditional research outputs. We're not really thinking about the bigger picture. So this is the bigger picture, and I've been to use an Australian term, I've been spruiking this for a while to try and get people to think about it, is that we're actually not just talking about open access anymore. We need to think about the ecosystem as a whole. And the ecosystem requires us to think about different publishing models, so different open publishing models. We need to think about how these are all linked together. We need to think about how interoperable these items, these outputs are. So that requires really good metadata, which I think is a vastly under considered issue. And we need to really think about how we link to data and software. So unless we think of this really big picture, whether we're talking about the SDGs, whether we're talking about other measures of how you measure access, we're actually going to only scratch the surface. And I would be really horrified if by 2030 we think we've got terribly good access to the PDFs of some research articles. That would be a disaster. If we haven't moved beyond that, I think we would have done ourselves a great disservice. And just to kind of show what this really means in practice. So free is free to read PDF, which is good. Nice to have, but obviously not the be-all and end-all. Open is what we've been talking about for quite a long time, which is usually with having a Creative Commons license associated with it, tells you exactly what you can do with it. But actually, we need to move beyond it. And there's a concept that people are now talking about, which is fair. Now, none of this is in the SDGs. This wasn't really an issue. This wasn't really a kind of concept when the SDGs were developed. Again, I think it's a shame that we haven't really had a chance to revisit it, and I think maybe that might be an opportunity. But fair is a concept that is increasingly important for data, and it's coming to be the same for research outputs, and it means findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. a key to all of this is metadata. Interoperability is in a format that can be exchanged. It's not read by humans, it can be read by machines, which we know is a very important group, and that we have the appropriate licenses. And these are the concepts that I think we should now be thinking about in any kind of concept around access to scholarship. So it looks like this, which is that we have structured formats, not just talking about PDFs. We have metadata, and the key metadata, I would say, are the DOIs, so the digital object identifiers for objects, and then the ORCID, which is the identifier for individuals. And I can't underestimate how important that is within the scholarly publishing system at the moment. If you haven't got your ORCID ID and you're an academic, come and talk to me afterwards. It's critically important, and I think will change fundamentally how scholarship advances. And if in case you're interested, these are some of the other initiatives that are being worked on. It's a very active area at the moment, and I think if we start to think about in this concept, we actually will be able to really use academic information in the way it needs to be. So one thing I think is also just worth bearing in mind when I talk to lots of academics about this, it's a massively complex system at the moment. I actually use this slide sometimes as an example of how great the diversity is, but I also know that when I talk to academics about it, it's like, please, I just want to publish in one journal, don't talk to me about all this other stuff. And I recognise that as a kind of a valid point of view. And it's really perhaps more a question for the audience. How do we actually help people to embrace this massive change that's happened? I won't go into what all of these are. All right, so let me just come back to OA, to equity and infrastructure. So Open Access Week is a thing that happens every year, usually at the end of October, but it also is a theme throughout the year. And it's driven by SPARC, which is the Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Coalition based in the US. We work very closely with them. And every year they try to have a theme around how do we promote open access. And last year's one was about access in order to do specific things. And this year's has a really interesting theme. So it is building the equitable foundations for open knowledge. Which sounds like a very clunky term, but it's a very deliberate term. And the reason it was chosen is because we as an organisation in Australia, but also SPARC in particular, recognise that as you move forward with open scholarship, you actually can potentially exclude lots of people. So if you have a publishing system that is exclusively moved from subscriptions to open access through article processing charges, you exclude pretty much half the world that can't pay those article processing charges. What about having things in the right language for individuals? That's a very big deal. What about having understanding that publishing in specific journals or only in journals excludes a whole group of people? What about the grey literature? What about having ensuring that individuals who publish within indigenous populations can actually have a place to publish that is appropriate for them? It's a massive issue, and once you start to unpick it, it becomes very obvious that access to knowledge is far more complicated than we've previously realised. So this is the theme for this year, and if you're interested in knowing more about it, I'd be very happy to talk to you about it. We ran a session in June this year, actually, and we had 3 early career researchers come and talk about it from their perspective. And the types of things they talked about were having access to data as part of open access, open scholarship. We had different types of journals and how that facilitates equity, and then we had sort of other approaches. It's a very complicated issue, and I feel like we are now beginning to have more interesting conversations about open access, but it's becoming more complicated as well. What I would just say is that in all of this, there is now an understanding that we need to consider what's happening globally. I'm not going to go through what all of these things are because there is a lot happening in both in the UK and in globally and in Australia. What we are seeing increasingly is that the change within open scholarship and the recognition of all these complex issues is coming more to the fore. And I showed you the slide about how the publishers have sort of eaten up all the current journals. What we're beginning to see now, which I feel is a very positive move, is that funders in particular are beginning to accept that they have to do something within this space. And the one, just if you're interested, the one that I'll just highlight here is this Coalition S that actually was announced a couple of days ago, which is an explicit recognition from a group of funders within Europe that they will no longer accept certain models of publishing that the publishers have been supporting. So the hybrid models of publishing, whereby you publish open access in a otherwise subscription journal, which is a very expensive way to publish, and also is potentially has kind of retarded or stopped change happening within OA quite dramatically. There is a lot happening within this space, and a lot of it is being driven by the big players. And what I see now as a really key issue is the need for us to sort of coalesce around some of these big initiatives. I think that the fact that we've not been able to do that previously has really held us back. Where does this leave us, kind of, I think, where we go next? When we're talking about, again, open scholarship, and we're talking about it in the context of things such as the SDGs, or really within any context, quality and integrity has become really important. When I talked earlier about the fact that you have access to information, we know that a lot of information that's published online is not very good quality. When I look back and looked at the SDGs and looked at the discussion around what we have access to, there is very little discussion about how you ensure what you access and the information that you use is high quality. And in fact, in the evaluation of the SDGs, that's only relatively recently been recognised as an issue. So I would urge that the quality and integrity is a really important issue that we need to consider. And I think that if we don't do that, then people will lose a lot of confidence within what's actually we have access to. I won't go through all of these, but I would just highlight again, and again, this issue about metadata is something that the SDGs have recognised as an importance in how you measure progress. So where next? I'm a great fan of Timeframes. I think that comes from being an editor for a long time. I think that the good thing about having the SDGs as a specific date is it does concentrate people's minds, at least. The fact that we are trying to measure them is good. The fact that the progress has not been great is at least up there to be noted. The time frame for open access and substantial change is 2020. You'll see a lot of that being mentioned. There's even initiatives called OA 2020. 2020 is not very far off. I mean, this initiative from Europe that I just mentioned, they plan to have by the 1st of January 2020 an expectation that everything will be available OA under the conditions that they've imposed. So things are moving really, really fast. And I think that is a good thing to note. I think that equity is something that has not thus previously been considered within OA. I'm really glad that has been included this year within the OA Week theme. I think people are really struggling to understand what that means, and I'd really be interested to hear people's thoughts about that. Infrastructure, again, I think has been sadly missed within the SDGs to some extent, and I think that if you just talk about a goal that is around openness, or access, that's not sufficient. And then the final thing is about this leadership and collaboration, and I feel like, again, we've missed a lot of opportunities to use the SDGs as a way of providing leadership. It's a bit unfashionable to talk about equity sometimes. People, when I talk to academics, they often want to know, access is around what's in it for me. But actually, equity is a valid goal. And I think that if there's one thing that I would really like to see come out of this, is a sort of explicit acknowledgement again that is an important thing for us to be coalescing around. Thanks very much.